Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sociology 111 Introduction to Sociology statewide synchronous sessions. Today, we're going to be covering race and ethnic inequality, which is Chapter 11 in the textbook. Some of the things that we're going to be examining include minority, racial, and ethnic groups, prejudice and discrimination, sociological perspectives on race and ethnicity, spectrum of intergroup relations, race and ethnicity here in the United States of America, and we'll be taking a look at social policy and its interaction with racial and ethnic inequality when we look at global immigration. So, the questions we'll be addressing: what is prejudice? How is it institutionalized in the form of discrimination? In what ways have race and ethnicity affected the experience of immigrants? What are the fastest growing minority groups in the United States today? So, what are the differences between race and ethnicity? What constitutes a minority group? Minority group is not just a group that is numerically smaller. A minority group is actually a group that is disadvantaged socially. It is a group that may be disenfranchised politically, have reduced economic opportunities, and that is socially stigmatized. Now, when we talk about race and ethnicity, people may become minority groups of being either a part of a racial group or an ethnic group. The difference really is what constitutes the basis for a racial or an ethnic group. A racial group is a group that is set apart because of an obvious physical characteristic. An ethnic group is a group set apart primarily because of its national origin or distinctive cultural patterns. So, race is a group that shares an obvious physical difference from a dominant group in society. An ethnic group is a group set apart because of a cultural heritage. It's a group that shares a cultural heritage. Now, these are not necessarily distinct categories. Race and ethnicity have some overlap within them. If we think about a term like Latino or Hispanic, in general, what we're referring to is a shared cultural heritage, specifically groups that come from Latin America and may share a linguistic heritage. Hispanic specifically refers to Spanish. Latino is a little bit broader term that refers to groups that share a Latin-based or what we would call a Romance language. But with regards to the appearance of Hispanics and Latinos, they do tend to have slightly darker skin on average, and there are some physical differences. So there is a little bit of overlap there. When we talk about a racial group, we tend to focus on skin color as the basis for a racial affiliation. There's more to it than that. There are other physical differences that get focused on, but in general, when we talk about race in the United States of America, we're talking about white and black. In fact, we use color to designate lots of different races. Black represents somebody with African heritage. White represents somebody with primarily Northern European or European heritage. We have used yellow at times to describe people with Asian heritage, red to describe people with Native American heritage. So we tend to use skin color as the basis for racial grouping. Both racial and ethnic groups can be minority groups. And as I said, a minority group is not necessarily a group that is just numerically smaller. When we talk about minority and majority, we're referring to more than just numbers. Minority groups have less access in society. They are stigmatized. They have social disadvantages. They can be the larger population in a group. If we think about women, female as a sex and a gender, They are considered a minority group, yet they number close to 51% of the population here. If we look outside the borders of the U.S., we look at South Africa. The black population in South Africa constitutes 80% of the population there. The white population is only about 20%. Yet the black population is the minority group. Some of the properties that minority groups include: unequal treatment, well, physical or cultural traits that are shared that are not shared by the larger dominant group in a society. It's an ascribed status. When we think about race and ethnicity, these can become not only ascribed status, they're not only ascribed statuses, but they can also become master statuses. People get defined by race if they're a minority group member. Think about our current president. Is he simply the next president, the 45th president of the United States of America, or is he the first black president? How many people think of him that way? Solidarity, a shared experiential heritage. That what we're talking about solidarity here is not the same type of solidarity that Durkheim was talking about when he talked about social cohesion, although it is a cohesive force. We're talking about a shared experience, a shared knowledge of treatment, things like that. When we talk about being a minority group member, or if we look at African Americans in the United States of America, some of you may have heard the saying, you know, you just wouldn't understand. It's a black experience. It's a black thing. You couldn't possibly understand. What they're referring to is this shared solidarity. The fact that white people may be disadvantaged in society, but not in the same way that black people are disadvantaged in our society. In-group marriage, or what we would call a homogenous tendency for marriage. Homogamy is the term for that. In-group marriage, and we'll look at that later when we get to the chapter on family and relationships, but in-group marriage is an endogamous marriage. E-N-D-O-G-A-M-Y. Endogamy refers to marriage within a particular group. Homogamy is the tendency to marry somebody who is very similar to you or is like you. In-group marriage can be described as a homogamous tendency towards endogamous marriage. Okay, so what's the idea behind the social construction of race? We talked about race, we talked about ethnicity. Race is basically focus on a physical characteristic. Ethnicity is focus on a cultural characteristic or heritage. Both of these categories are socially constructed categories, though. The first time race was actually used to be applied to people was during the age of exploration. Prior to that, people knew that there were different skin colors, and individuals would be identified sometimes by their skin color. But it was during the age of exploration and colonization from the European perspective that race began to be applied to the differences, the physical differences noted between inhabitants of Europe, inhabitants of Africa, inhabitants of the Americas, inhabitants of Asia. There were obvious physical differences. Prior to that, race was used in the way that we use the term breed currently, to refer to different types of animals within a single species. Different breeds of dogs in the 13th century would have been referred to as different races of dogs. So when we say the social construction of race, it's roughly 5 genes that control the level of melanin in a person's skin. That's not, from a biological standpoint, a significant amount of genes. If you think about the Human Genome Project, they're mapping all the genes in a strand of DNA, and it's a project that's been going on for a number of years because there are so many genes. Only 5 of those control the level of melanin in skin. However, those 5 genes, while biologically not meaning a whole lot, socially have come to mean quite a bit, because we focus on racial differences using skin color as the method by which we differentiate people. So when we talk about race being a social construction, what we're saying there is we're not actually different species. We have picked an obvious physical characteristic and attached importance to that, even though from a biological standpoint it isn't that important. And when we talk about differences between races, we're talking about a small percentage of the difference between individuals. About 85% of the difference that happens between people happens on an individual basis. You will find more variation within any race than you will find between races. So the majority of variation between people on Earth comes on an individual basis. But that's not to say that race is not something that affects people's lives, because race has importance attached to it socially. Because we, as a society, collectively continue to believe race is important, regardless of the fact that biologically there's not a whole lot of difference between people, race continues to affect people's lives, people's chances, people's outcomes, all that kind of stuff. I alluded to a little bit of this, but racial formation is the idea behind which race comes to be a social category. In 18th and 19th century America, ethnic differences were referred to as racial differences. The Irish were actually considered to be a different race, and so were the Italians. They were not part of what we would think of when we say the white race. When we think of race today, we talk about white, we're really referring to skin color. It doesn't matter what part of Europe you came from or where in the world you came from. It matters if you're categorized as part of the white race, which people from France, people from Ireland, people from England, people from the Scandinavian countries, people from Germany, people would all be kind of categorized that way. In the 19th century, that was not true. Ethnic minorities, white ethnic minorities, were considered racial minorities at the same time, and they were not considered part of the white race. When this country was founded in 1776, what it meant to be white actually had a physical characteristic, a cultural characteristic, a religious characteristic, all 3 of those. There was a linguistic characteristic. You had to be a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, or what was termed a WASP, in order to be considered part of the dominant racial group in the United States of America. During the 20th century, a lot of these ethnic and religious parts of that have come to be less important. So we've seen the idea of what it means to be white transformed. So, race as a concept was created because European explorers noticed physical differences between themselves and people inhabiting other regions of the world. Inhibited, of course, opportunities are denied. In fact, during the 19th century, there were a lot of what are called anti-miscegenation laws, prohibiting what we would refer to as a mixed-race marriage. Native Americans, there was an attempt to eradicate their culture, to get them to assimilate into U.S. society during all of the 19th century. Children would be taken away from the lands where their tribe lived, taken away from their parents, given anglicized names, and educated in schools in an attempt to get them to assimilate into U.S. society and discard their own particular cultural heritage. One-drop rule is another example of racial formation. Essentially, the one-drop rule, which came about because of the legacy of slavery in this country, The idea behind that is one drop of African blood is enough to make you black in our society. This was actually established as a legal precedent in a Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy was a young man who was what would have been described at the time as an octoroon. One of 8 great-grandparents was a slave and had African heritage. The other 7 were considered white. Yet, the Supreme Court ruled that Homer Plessy could not ride on a whites-only car. That was what he was suing for, was the right, because he had 7 out of 8 great-grandparents who were described as white. He felt he should have been able to ride on the car for whites only. This is where the one drop or the octoroon rule came from, which essentially said if you have any African blood at all, you are not white, you are black in U.S. society. And this kind of comes out of the legacy of the slave codes during the period of slavery, which stated that slavery was an inherited status. If one of your parents was a slave, you were a slave. You couldn't claim that because one of your parents was a free white person, you should be given freedom. It was established legally that if one of the parents of a person was a slave, that person was a slave. Recently, the census has begun to adopt, the U.S. Census has begun to adopt a wider practice, allowing people to self-identify as members of a number of different races. That should be 1890, not 1990. In 1890, W.E.B. Du Bois predicted the color line would be the foremost problem of the 20th century. As we went through the Reconstruction period and the Jim Crow era began to emerge, and Jim Crow laws began to emerge, and we went through the Jim Crow and segregation era leading up to the Civil Rights era, the color line did become a huge problem. However, when we think about being black in U.S. society and being Latino in U.S. society, where does someone like Sammy Sosa fall? He's obviously got African heritage, but he speaks Spanish because he's from the Caribbean. And so when we look at immigration from Latin America, we can see how this affects the idea of racial formation. And it shows immigration from Latin America shows the fluid nature of race formation, because we had a society that was largely biracial, and immigration might be somewhat incorrect considering what followed the Mexican-American War and then the Spanish-American War, where the U.S. was ceded territories that had traditionally been the home of Spanish-speaking peoples. There were a lot of people who so-called immigrated to the United States of America without ever moving one step. Residents of Arizona, Southern California, Texas, and New Mexico, following the end of the Mexican-American War, without moving, went from being part of the majority group to being part of the minority group. But anyway, our biracial society is replaced by a triracial society. The 3 largest groups in our society are white, black, and Hispanic or Latino. Now, when we think about these groups and the way that they interact with each other, one of the forms that bigotry takes and prejudice takes is when stereotypes are used to create expectations of behavior. Stereotypes, of course, do not account for individuality. They basically say that as a member of this group of people, this is what you like, this is what you do, and this is how you act. And so stereotypes, there are stereotypes of both African Americans and Hispanic Americans that are still somewhat reinforced and reproduced even currently in our current society. So this is just a quick breakdown here. Racial and ethnic identity. Now, if you look at the table on the right, you see Germans, Irish, English, Italian, Polish, Scottish, French, Jewish. Except for the English, during the 19th century, all of those other groups were considered not considered part of the white race and were considered separate, different categories. If you look at the table on the left, of course, you see white, non-Hispanic. That's where the ethnic group breakdown comes from. African Americans or blacks, Native Americans, Alaskan Natives. They're somewhat separate groups, but they both are the remnants of peoples that are part of the pre-Columbian population of the U.S. We've got Asian Americans, and then Hispanics or Latinos. Those percentages, it's in somewhat of a state of flux. I've heard the percentage of black or African American as high as 13%, Hispanic or Latino 16% roughly, of which the majority are Mexican Americans. The white, non-Hispanic white is somewhere around roughly 65%. And then you've got Asian Americans, and then Native Americans. So, if we look at a historical breakdown, the period of time, if you look, say, between 2010, 64% white non-Hispanic. If you look at 2100, 90 years from 2010, see 40% white non-Hispanic. It is predicted that sometime between roughly 2045 and 2055, that is the point at which, although they will still be the largest racial group, the white population will be outnumbered by the totality of minority populations. They will be less than 50% of the population. And so when we look, we can see the fastest growing group right now is Hispanic Americans, followed by Asian Americans. African Americans are holding roughly steady as a percentage of the population, and are projected to continue to do that. Because even as the population grows, right now we get a lot of people who refer to themselves as Africans. They immigrate from Africa itself during the 21st century, and also a lot of immigrants from Afro-Caribbean who would identify as Afro-Caribbean. Immigrants from Jamaica, Haiti, Bermuda, who live in U.S. society but don't necessarily share in the legacy of the historical African American experience in U.S. society. So that's a look at race. Now let's look a little bit more at ethnicity. And remember, there's some interplay between race and ethnicity. When we talk about Hispanic and Latino, on also Asian American, Native American, those are what can be referred to sort of as what would be called pan-ethnic identities, because these identities are almost more like racial categories in that they're focusing on a physical and cultural characteristic. But when we look at the breakdown, if you remember from the table, in Asian Americans, there are a lot of different countries represented. In Latin Americans, Latinos, there are a lot of different countries represented as well. But ethnic group, because of national origin or distinctive cultural patterns. As I said, there is interplay between the concepts of race and ethnicity. You cannot say clearly that somebody is either a racial or an ethnic minority. But both racial and ethnic groups have are socially constructed, and the importance is a social construct as well. Prejudice and discrimination. One of them, for the most part, is legal. One of them, for the most part, is illegal. Prejudice is thoughts, attitudes, beliefs, what you think about a particular thing. When we talk about prejudice with regards to race and ethnicity, what we're really talking about there are negative beliefs, negative attitudes towards an entire category of people. Ethnocentrism is the idea that my culture is the best, my group is the best. Anybody who doesn't want to live like I live is obviously wrong. There's something wrong with them, because the way I live is better than any other culture or lifestyle out there. Anytime you hear an ism, racism, ethnocentrism, sexism, ageism, ethnicism, classism, it's one group of people essentially thinking that they're better than another group of people. Racism, the belief that one race is supreme and others are inherently inferior. Sexism, the idea that one sex is better than the other sex. Ageism, the idea that being a certain age is better than being another age. Classism, the idea that being one class is better than being another class. Class, of course, referring to economic distinctions. Hate crimes are crimes committed on the basis of ethnocentrism or racism. It can be also because of sexual orientation, but they're crimes committed against an individual because of an unreasonable hatred of the group with which that individual affiliates. You have hate crimes against blacks. Lynching is the perfect example of that. Hate crimes against gays, hate crimes against all sorts of different groups. So, colorblind racism is something that a lot of people sometimes have trouble understanding. But if I, as a white person living in the United States of America, say I believe that I should be granted more opportunities because I am white, that's racism. If, however, I say we don't need affirmative action programs because everybody has equal opportunities now, while understanding that that is not true, then that I still have advantages because I'm white, that's the idea of colorblind racism. Being disadvantaged as part of a minority group is not just something that exists in the here and the now. It is a generational thing that it creates a cumulative effect on individuals at the current time. So if I say we don't need affirmative action because there's no more racism in the U.S. society, it ignores the fact that historically, the family from which I come had all sorts of opportunities provided to them. And so my starting point in society is higher than the starting point of somebody who comes from a minority group, because historically their families have been disadvantaged, and so they have a much lower starting point in society. And so the idea that society should be colorblind continues this racial inequality. The idea that racism is gone allows the legacy of racism to continue unchallenged. And that's what we mean by colorblind racism. Because there is still racism in our society. And when you hear somebody saying, why are you always playing the race card? Essentially, they're trying to defend their privileged position, trying to defend the fact that a color line still exists without actually saying it does. Okay. Prejudice leads to discrimination. Discrimination is the one that's illegal. Prejudice is legal. You can think whatever you want. You have that right. You have that freedom. To a certain extent, you can even say whatever you want as long as it doesn't cross over into hate speech or dangerous speech like yelling fire in a crowded theater when there is no fire. Discrimination, for the most part, is not legal, because that is when you put prejudice into action. You deny people opportunities and equal rights because they're part of a particular group of people. When we come to the chapter on gender and sex and sexual orientation, and we discuss sexual orientation, the people who believe that they should be able to define marriage between a man and a woman because that's what a majority of people in their particular region or in their particular state believe are kind of ignoring the fact that they're practicing discrimination. The right to marry is one of the assumed rights of our society, and the right to marry whoever you choose is one of the assumed rights of our society. There are people who are denied this right on the basis of who they choose. That's discrimination. It is not discrimination to prohibit somebody from putting practices into place that are discriminatory. Oftentimes you might hear people say, well, my religious rights are being violated because I believe marriage should be between a man and a woman. Well, that's fine. Don't marry another man if you're a man. Don't marry another woman if you're if you're a woman. And as I said, we'll talk more about this. But what we're talking about here is the denial of opportunities. This is the part that's illegal. And it is not racism, discrimination, prejudice are not things that only happen to lower classes. Educated and qualified minority members who have made it into the upper middle class and the upper class still suffer racism, discrimination, and prejudice. A lot of times they may run into what's called the glass ceiling. Essentially what this means is that members of minority groups are placed into job tracks that lead to a dead end, that lead to a position that may be a fairly high position, but a position from which there is no way to move up higher in a company on the basis of gender, race, or ethnicity. You heard me mention white privilege. When I get pulled over by a police officer, because I might be speeding, because I might have a traffic, a signal light out, because my license plate may have fallen off, but for whatever reason, when I get pulled over by a police officer, in general, I am not in fear of my life. Increasingly in our society, members of minority groups, and specifically African American minority groups, the male members of African American minority group, have to wonder, even if they're dressed in a suit and tie, if I get pulled over by a police officer, is that going to result in me getting shot? Now, the concept of institutional discrimination is when you have outcomes in society that are overtly discriminatory but do not result from any type of law or policy. You do not have discriminatory policies, it's just that all your outcomes are discriminatory. For example, there was a researcher who was looking into how having a felony record affects getting hired. And she wanted to measure this. And she decided to also look and see if race affects hiring practices as well at the same time. So she created a pool of 4 applicants, 2 white, 2 black. 1 white person had a criminal record, 1 black person had a criminal record. And she made them as similar as she could in all the other characteristics, as far as experience, education, prior salaries, prior positions, all that kind of stuff. She tried to make them as similar as possible. And then she sent them out to turn in resumes to see how many second interviews they could possibly get. And what she found was that, yes, having a felony record does reduce opportunities. She also found that race has almost as great an effect as having a felony record, because the number of callbacks for second interviews that the white person with a felony record received was equal to the number of callbacks for a second interview that a black person without a felony record received. She did this in 2 areas. She did it first in Milwaukee, and she thought, well, you know, Milwaukee has a legacy of racism, so maybe I should check this out in New York. And she went and did it in New York, and in New York she got the same results. That's institutional discrimination. Either that or we have to assume that every HR department in over 100 companies was willing to put discriminatory policies, which are illegal, and take a chance of being fined or fired, into practice, to put their own prejudice into practice, their own racist beliefs into practice. Or as a society, we're equally as willing to offer a white person with a felony record a job as a black person without a felony record. To oppose institutional discrimination, a lot of companies adopt what are called affirmative action policies. Now, these are essentially reverse discrimination put into practice, because it gives favorable status to minority status, to recruit minority members, whether it's racial, ethnic, gender, minority members, for jobs, promotion, and educational opportunities. Recently, affirmative action has come under a lot of fire from both members of the dominant group and members of the minority group, simply because places that have affirmative action means that if you're a minority hired into a position at a place that has affirmative action, you can never be sure that you were the most qualified candidate. And members of the dominant group feel like they may be overlooked even if they're more qualified. Now, the way that affirmative action is supposed to work is that if you have 2 applicants who are equal on a wide range of criteria, and there is no way to make a distinction between them as far as one being better than the other, if one is a minority member, then you use affirmative action. But the practice of having quotas sometimes leads to less qualified people getting hired. But when we look at this chart right here, we can see that things are not always equal, are they? If we look at median incomes, we see that when we control for everything else, there's still an income gap that exists. So, let's look at the theoretical perspectives. From a functionalist perspective, there is actually functions provided by racist beliefs. It allows people to maintain an unequal society and feel justified in doing so. It discourages subordinate groups from questioning their status and encourages support for the existing order. So if we believe that whites are inherently superior to blacks, this allows us to justify slavery, to justify reduced opportunities, to justify political disenfranchisement. They wouldn't understand enough about politics, so we shouldn't really let them vote because they won't vote in a logical fashion. So when we have like a racist ideology that actually allows for inequality to be continued. Now, remember, from a functionalist perspective, sometimes we can have social dysfunction as well as social function. Because people are denied opportunities at education, people are denied opportunities to participate fully in society, society is denied the potential of those individuals. Further, allowing overt discrimination may lead to riots in the streets, things like that. Society has to keep its population educated on why we're allowing discrimination to continue. So society must invest resources into maintaining segregated status, maintaining the barriers to full participation. And finally, it's easy for us to sit here in the United States of America and decry the former apartheid policy in South Africa, yet we have just as much segregation and discrimination in our society as existed there. So racism provides some function to society, but it also provides dysfunction. And remember, that's all about whether it's maintaining social stability or beginning to destabilize society. Inevitably, of course, it destabilized society. The social dysfunctions outweighed the social functions in the U.S. Social unrest just rose to the point where it can no longer be ignored. Conflict perspective looks at it a little bit differently. It says that essentially we have a racist ideology so that we have cheap labor that can be exploited for the benefits of the elites in society. However, this can offer some explanation, but it doesn't explain all prejudice. How does this explain prejudice from people within the same class as the people they're prejudiced against? Sure, everybody's heard of racial profiling. There's the law in New York, the Stop and Frisk program. There's Arizona SB 1070, which has been referred to the racial profiling. There's evidence that the TSA practices racial profiling. So there have been a lot of examples of it recently that have been discussed in the media. But essentially, racial profiling is the idea that We can use race and racial stereotypes to investigate certain people. All Muslims are terrorists. So if you're a Muslim, well, you don't have the right to not be searched by me. All teenage males of African American or Hispanic origin have a tendency towards criminal behavior. So we can stop and frisk any suspicious looking individuals. In Arizona, of course, the idea there is that anybody who's over the border, and anybody who's on the U.S. side of the border that appears to be Hispanic, might have come here or must have come here illegally. So we need them to establish citizenship. Some of the stereotypes that lead to this type of behavior I've just described. 2010, Americans were okay with, if you look Arabic, if you've got an Arabic sounding name, or if you're wearing garb that might indicate you're a Muslim, it's okay if you get selected for the additional security screening. Problem with that is there were 20 people responsible for the planes. There are 1.75 billion Muslims in the world. When I say 20 people on the flights, there were probably more than that involved in the planning and everything, training and everything else. However, we're looking at a minority of the Muslim population who practices terrorism. But when we think that it's okay that 90% of the people who were selected for additional screening either had an Arabic sounding name, Muslim garb, or just looked like they could be from that part of the world. How do we decrease racism? Well, that's what the contact hypothesis is all about. If you have contact between people from different racial and ethnic groups, and you have to have favorable outcomes in the cooperative effort in which they're engaged, this will cause people to become less prejudiced and to abandon old stereotypes. You need to have favorable outcomes. That's part of this, which it doesn't say in there, but you do need to have favorable outcomes. When you're engaged in cooperative circumstances with favorable outcomes, contact hypothesis says that then we can see a reduction in prejudice, a reduction in discrimination, and the abandonment of stereotyping individuals. If you have negative outcomes, it doesn't have any effect on reducing prejudice and discrimination. All right, just taking a quick look here. Sociological perspectives on race and ethnicity. Functionalist perspective, conflict perspective, labeling, and interactionist. Labeling is technically part of the interactionist perspective. But yeah, if we look at this, the dominant majority benefits from the subordination of racial minorities. And society overall benefits. Conflict interest, the elites benefit through economic exploitation. Labeling theory, race, ethnicity are labels that are externally applied that have social consequences. And finally, interactionist, cooperative interracial contacts with favorable outcomes can reduce hostility. If you have unfavorable outcomes in that cooperative effort, it has no effect whatsoever on reducing hostility. So how do groups interact with each other? There are a number of ways. Friendships, intermarriage, hostility. There are 5 broad categories of interaction that can occur between racial, ethnic, religious, any type of group you want. Genocide is the deliberate elimination of one group by another group. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the basis of race or ethnicity. It can happen on the basis of religion. The subject of the movie Hotel Rwanda was conflict between the Hutu and Tutsi peoples. From a perspective over here, they would really be described as one group of people. They had distinctions themselves. You were one if you had 10 cattle and a longer nose. That was how they defined the difference between themselves. So it's not necessarily that it has to be on the basis of race or ethnicity, or even culture. It can be some things because they would have been considered the same culture as well. Expulsion is another way. Let's just get this group out of our territory. We don't want them here anymore, right? Amalgamation. A majority and minority group combine to form something entirely new that has elements of both and yet is not one or the other. Some people may believe that's what's happening in the U.S. No, most of the trends indicate that we're not really a melting pot. We are not an amalgamation of all different peoples. There are dominant and subordinate relations in the United States of America. The amalgamation is not what's really going on. Assimilation is kind of what's going on in the United States of America. You want to get ahead in the U.S., you have to assimilate into the dominant cultural pattern. And this is really where a person or an immigrant really kind of discards their own cultural heritage in favor of adopting the dominant cultural heritage in a particular geographic region. Now, it's not a guarantee of social acceptance, but it can increase opportunity. Segregation, separate but equal. This is where we actually keep the two groups apart. This is what was going on during the Jim Crow era. This was what was going on in South Africa under apartheid. It's the physical separation with separate facilities. It is not the subordinate group in general that says we want to stay apart from the dominant group. It's the dominant group that imposes this. It mentions apartheid there. There was actually a book written by a couple of sociologists, Massey and Denton, called American Apartheid, which refers to the economic segregation going on in U.S. society. Because our society is every bit as segregated in some respects as the Republic of South Africa. Pluralism is what a lot of people ideologically believe the U.S. is. Everybody's culture is respected and everybody's culture has value in U.S. society. As I said, we're not really a pluralist or an amalgamated society. We're more of an assimilation society. Pluralism is more of an ideal than a reality in the U.S., regardless of how we might like to think about it. You want to get ahead, you have to adopt the dominant cultural patterns. Switzerland is more of a pluralistic state. They have 3 languages that are spoken by the people that they recognize. They grant citizenship regardless of cultural heritage. So they are more of a pluralistic state in which all cultural heritages are respected as valuable. So we've got amalgamation, genocide, segregation, assimilation, and pluralism as the 5 dominant patterns in which people can come together. Expulsion, you can look at that either as an extreme form of segregation or cultural genocide, in which you're removing a culture from your society. So, taking a little bit more of a specific look here in the United States of America, African Americans suffer a poverty rate of about 25%, which is more than double the poverty rate of the white population in the United States of America, which averages somewhere between 9 and 10%. We discussed the next point a little bit. The experience of African Americans in contemporary society is rooted in the history of slavery. Some of the things like that some researchers, theoretical constructs that they use to look at this, one would be W.E.B. Du Bois's idea of double consciousness. Double consciousness is when you view yourself not only through the lens of your own eyes and own experiences, but also through the critical lens of the dominant society. Ways that double consciousness plays out are differences in shopping patterns. If I walk into a store with my briefcase, I don't even think twice about opening my briefcase up to get my wallet out to check to see how much money I have, regardless of what part of the store I'm in, because I do not believe that I am automatically going to be assumed to be a shoplifter. Black person will be much more cautious about doing that because they realize that the cultural assumption there is that they're opening their bag to put something in it. Black Power was a social movement that began in roughly 1968 in response to increased violence against the African American community following the civil rights movement and civil rights legislation. They rejected the goal of assimilating into middle-class white society and said that we need to protect our own, we need to create our own communities. Like I said, it was in large part a response to an increased level of violence from the white community towards the black community. Life chances is a concept that Max Weber coined. The idea there is that your life chances essentially stem from your origin point in society, and depending on where you originate in society, that shapes your life chances, the chances you have to be successful, to be happy, to have a good job, to get an education, all the goals we have in society. Because of the history of slavery and oppression, economic and political disenfranchisement, blacks suffer in terms of their life chances. Here's just kind of looking at, we've got the 5 major ways of coming together here on a little bit of a spectrum. So when we look at a spectrum of intergroup relationships, genocide, segregation, secession, expulsion, have become increasingly viewed as violation of human rights, and so high-income nations are supposed to reject these in favor of assimilation, amalgamation, pluralism, which are ways that groups should be interacting. Native Americans, in 1900, there were estimated to be at least 10 million Native Americans living in the continental United States. In 1800, rather. I'm sorry, in 1800. By 1900, that was down to roughly 250,000 people. That's an example of genocide. Currently, there are 2.5 million people who identify as Native American, and there were something like 600 distinct cultures In pre-Columbian times in the continental United States of America, a lot of those see 554 distinct tribal groups. A lot of them were encouraged to assimilate. That's why so many Native Americans have very English-sounding names. But when we look at this, some of them have begun bettering themselves through the use of Native American casinos. But this is not something that's happening for all of them. And in general, Native Americans remain among the most disadvantaged minority group, among the most disadvantaged peoples as a minority group whole in the U.S. Life on the reservation is rife with poverty. Unemployment can run as high as 50% on some of the reservations. The Native American gambling casinos have enabled Native Americans to make improvements on the reservations that have those. Not everyone has those, though. Asian Americans, one of the fastest growing segments of the U.S. population. We have a lot of immigrants coming in from China. We've had historical immigrant groups from Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Philippines. Additionally, the Indian subcontinent, technically that's part of Asia. So Indian immigrants from the Indian subcontinent. We have large numbers coming in from India, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh as well. So it is a very diverse group. Asian American, again, is what we would call a pan-ethnic identity. It's an overarching ethnic identity that has almost like a racial component to it that subsumes a lot of cultural diversity. When we talk about a model or ideal minority, this is a group that without affirmative action managed to be successful in U.S. society. Part of that is through their focus on education. Part of that is because of cultural concepts and ideas and values that they brought with them. They provide a lot more help for new immigrants in communities. But oftentimes other groups are told, why can't you be more like this group? Look at what they've managed to do without affirmative action. Why do you claim that you need affirmative action? They've never protested, never gone out into the streets, never marched, never confronted the dominant group in society, and yet they have managed to succeed economically, socially, and educationally in large part. The economic success is founded upon a focus on educational success. But when we looked at those median incomes, Asian Americans actually have a higher median income than white Americans do. So how many different groups are there? Well, we've got Chinese Americans. During the time that the Pacific Railroad was being built, we wanted immigrants from China. Slavery had been done away with in 1865, and so we needed a source of cheap labor. The Chinese immigrants provided that, but following the completion of the Pacific Railroad and the connecting of the Eastern and Western railroads in Utah, Chinese began to be seen as undesirable elements, eventually leading to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which made it illegal for people from China to immigrate to the U.S. Sorry, 1888. There are over 3 million Chinese Americans currently, people who identify as Chinese American. There may be a lot more than that who have some of the heritage. if you actually visit what they call a Chinatown, you will find rampant poverty, some very hard working conditions. There is a brisk trade in human trafficking, bringing Chinese immigrants over here. They wind up working in low-wage jobs in horrible conditions. As I said, Asian Indians, people from India, large number of people here, over 2.6 million, second largest group of Asian Americans. Some of the people have actually run into problems from practicing their religion. One group of people that come from India are a group called the Sikhs, S-I-K-H, Sikh, and they are the people that wear the large turbans. Unfortunately, some people who are prejudiced against Arabs and Muslims don't understand the distinction between an Indian Sikh and an Arabic Muslim, and some Sikhs have actually been beaten severely because of those mistakes. Traditions like arranged marriage, the caste system, are antithetical to U.S. cultural values, so maintaining family traditions becomes problematic here in the U.S., where over the past 150 years or so, we have gone from arranged marriages to romantic love as the basis of marriage, and our belief, stemming back to the founding of this country, that a person's own individual skills and talents should determine their place in society, not some type of hereditary ascribed status. Filipino Americans from the Philippines, following the Spanish-American War, the Philippines were one of 4 territories ceded to the U.S. from Spain. There was Cuba, the Philippines, Midway, and for the life of me, I cannot remember the 4th territory. Anyway, there's a large population here from the Philippines. They began immigrating to the U.S. as American nationals because when they were a territory, they enjoyed a similar status. Puerto Rico, of course, that was the 4th territory. As Puerto Ricans. Puerto Ricans, when they come to America, it's not really, it is immigration, but from the standpoint of citizenship, they are already considered citizens of the U.S. A significant percentage of Filipino immigrants are well-educated professionals. There is a fairly significant population of white people living in the Philippines. I actually had a friend in Kansas City who his family owned a lot of land in the Philippine Islands. Some others, Vietnamese Americans, came to U.S. primarily during and after the Vietnam War. Gravitated towards larger urban areas. Significantly, one of the areas in which a lot of them settled was the Burlington, around Burlington, Vermont. They were welcomed there. Vermont, which has a largely homogeneous white population, in the latter half of the 20th century and the first part of the 21st century, has been extraordinarily welcoming of immigrants from other regions of the world. And recently, Vermont spoke up and said that they would take the children that were coming up from Latin America because of civil war in their countries. But a lot of the lost children of Sudan wound up in that area. Bosnian immigrants have wound up in that area. Vermont has been incredibly welcoming of immigrant groups. Korean Americans, there's larger numbers of Korean Americans than Japanese Americans. A lot of that was following the Korean War. Their culture, a lot of times we have trouble distinguishing. We recognize China and Japan as two Asian countries, but others sometimes get overshadowed, and Korean Americans are one of the groups that tend to get overshadowed by other Asian groups. There was an initial wave between 1903 and 1910, and then, as I said, a second wave following the Korean War, or technically the Korean police action, because Congress never formally declared war in Korea. And then the Immigration Reform Act, Immigration and Naturalization Act in 1965, which allowed family members, started a third wave. If you had family members in the U.S., they could sponsor you to immigrate here. Japanese Americans, one of the smaller groups in U.S. society, probably shouldn't be that surprised by that because of the internment camps in World War II. But there are approximately 100,000 living in U.S. now. They divide themselves into categories based upon what generation they are. Issei, first generation Japanese immigrants. As I mentioned, there were the internment camps. 1988, the U.S. decided to pay reparations to the Japanese Americans that were forced into camps in response to World War II, and the belief that all of them were what would be called fifth columnists. Even Japanese that were third, fourth, and fifth generation here were not trusted by U.S. society at large. Arab Americans, now interestingly enough, when we talk about Arab Americans and we talk about Muslim Americans, if we look at Muslims as immigrants coming in, the majority of Muslims that immigrate to the U.S. society actually originate in Pakistan and will be more akin to Asian Indian than they would be to Arab. The majority of Arab Americans living in U.S. society are longer-term immigrants, and we're talking about third, fourth, fifth, and sixth generation, and the majority of them tend to be Christian as well. Some people who have Arab ancestry that might be surprising, say Ralph Nader for one, the consumer advocate. But Arab and Muslim Americans both right now are feeling the greatest amount of prejudice and discrimination because of the events of 2001, 9/11, and they are the group for which most other racial and ethnic groups feel the greatest social distance in U.S. society right now. Latinos, roughly 16% of the population, largest group. There's a more modest level of upward mobility than past generations. Some of that depends on which of the particular Latino cultures you come from. Cuban Americans tend to have more upward mobility than Mexican Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, or any of the other Latin American countries. Largest group at roughly 60%. Is Mexican Americans. Puerto Ricans are the second largest. They come here for opportunity. There's been a huge debate over immigration, of course. NAFTA really increased the number of Mexican Americans coming across the border, both legally and illegally, because when we started dumping our corn into the Mexican market, we put a lot of small farmers out of business, and the small farmers are the ones that come up here illegally looking for work, the ones that become the laborers, because they could no longer pursue their traditional practice of making money, which was small farming of corn. But immigration has intensified debates, bilingualism or bilingual education. Right now, the DREAM Act is being debated, and that will be another one of these acts which would allow illegal immigrants who are already in U.S. society, already have jobs, are already contributing to the economy. It would allow them to have a path to citizenship. It wouldn't be automatic. They wouldn't be automatically granted citizenship, but they could apply and become legal residents and then eventually citizens. There's a shared heritage of Spanish language and culture among the majority of them: Mexican Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, Cuban Americans. It's certainly true of those, and those are roughly the three largest groups. There are countries that are Latino that are not necessarily Hispanic, like Brazil for one, Haiti, that are considered part of the Caribbean, but speak a language other than Spanish. In Brazil, they speak Portuguese. In Haiti, they speak French. Mexican Americans tend to be overwhelmingly Roman Catholic. Interestingly enough, though, one of the churches that's making inroads in the Mexican population is actually the Church of Latter-day Saints. More and more Mexican Americans are converting to Mormonism. Church provides a sense of continuity. It helps them assimilate into U.S. society, and so there are a lot of churches, or their word for it would actually be iglesias, where Spanish is the primary language spoken. And not all of them are Roman Catholic. A lot of them are, and a quinceañera I attended and was a padrino at in Tucson, the service was held in a Roman Catholic church. But from living in Tucson, there are also some fundamentalist churches that the primary language spoken is Spanish. Puerto Ricans are American citizens. They are not immigrants per se when they come here. From a cultural perspective, yes, they are. But from like a citizen perspective, they're just citizens moving from one U.S. territory to another. There's serious poverty among the Puerto Rican population. A large number of them have settled in and around New York City, Brooklyn, the Bronx, those areas. Cuban Americans tend to be the most affluent. There was some immigration prior to the Castro Revolution, but following Castro's assumption of power, what you saw then was one of the distinctions between Mexican Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, and then Cuban Americans is Mexican Americans and Puerto Rican Americans. The elements that immigrate to U.S. society are lower class, unskilled laborers who are not educated. Following the Cuban Revolution, the Cuban immigrants coming in here were in general the educated professionals who constituted the middle and upper class. Because they were the ones that had the most to lose under the Castro regime. And so they already had more of a focus on education. And honestly, when we looked at that chart and you saw that Latinos had a median income that was very low, Cuban American median income tends to be just slightly behind white non-Hispanic American median incomes. Latino is another one of these pan-ethnic identities under which Mexican Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, Cuban Americans, and immigrants from Colombia, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Belize, and other countries, Argentina and Chile, are all kind of lumped together under that rubric, but there's a diverse population. When we look at Central and South America, they tend to use more of what's called a color gradient. Specifically, like if we go to Brazil, Brazil actually has a multiplicity of racial categories that don't exist in the U.S. The U.S. it's black, white. In Brazil, there's black, yellow, tan, brown, white, at least 5 distinct racial categories. So the dichotomous approach to race in the U.S. can lead to culture shock for immigrants coming from some of these countries. Jewish Americans, outside of Israel, the population of Jewish people in the United States is one of the largest population of Jewish people of any country. Like I said, outside of Israel. But they constitute about 2% of our population. Anti-Semitism is prejudice against the Jewish people, the Semitic people. Anti-Semitism runs rapid throughout the Arab world. The interesting thing about that is that from like a historical cultural perspective, Jewish people and Arabic peoples both culturally kind of came out of the Semitic peoples, or considered Semitic peoples. Right now, though, anti-Semitism refers specifically to Jewish people. You can see some of the similarities in similarities between Hebrew and Arabic and Aramaic, which was the language that Jesus spoke. So Jewish identity is a religious identity, but increasingly it has become more of a cultural identity than just a religious identity. I mean, there's still a religious identity there, but a lot of Jewish people have become a little bit more secularized, not observing the traditional practices of Judaism, and so they have become somewhat indistinguishable, even if they practice and go to Jewish temples and maintain their cultural heritage appearance-wise. They have assimilated more into society. But if you think about the Hasidic Jews and the Orthodox Jews, the ones that wear the yarmulkes and don't shave the hair or cut the hair at the temples so that they have the long curls on the side, that sets them out. That really sets them apart and marks them as belonging to the Jewish religion and culture. White ethnics have had to assimilate over the course of the 18th and 19th centuries in the United States of America. As I mentioned earlier, originally white meant white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Even as late as 1960, not being Protestant could be an issue. JFK, during his campaign, had to specifically address how he would not allow his Catholicism to influence his presidency because of a distrust of Catholics among a large segment of the U.S. population. But a lot of the immigration happened in the last 150 years. Irish, Italian, Polish, and other groups, Swedish, have all immigrated over here. A lot of the ethnicity that is maintained by these groups is what could be referred to as symbolic ethnicity. There's a lot of people who know what's going on in Ireland, like in Northern Ireland with the IRA. They know the politics, they know the culture, but actually speaking Gaelic is something that very few can do. So it's symbolic ethnicity is kind of a surface ethnicity. Having corned beef and cabbage on St. Paddy's Day and knowing what's going on with the IRA would be symbolic ethnicity. Interestingly, though, when we talk about Ireland, There are about 4 million residents of the island of Ireland. There are roughly 36 million people in the U.S., 33 to 36 million people in the U.S. that claim to be Irish American. Increasingly, what it means to be Irish is being defined in the U.S. To the consternation of the people living in Ireland. Okay. This is another one of the sociology and the global community. If we think about Aboriginal people of Australia, the same thing that happened to Native Americans here happened to the Aboriginal people of Australia. Children were taken away from parents, relocated by the government, and then re-educated into the dominant cultural ideology. Really, the reasoning behind that was the same reasoning that the U.S. government used when they practiced the same thing here. We're going to get them to assimilate into our culture and kind of wipe their culture out. Turnout among Latinos is historically low in elections. They don't see themselves represented on the ballot that much. They don't see the point of participating in politics because their concerns are never really addressed during campaign season. One of the ways that George Bush was actually able to win the presidency was that he capitalized on that, and he campaigned in Spanish promising to address Latino concerns in 2000. Now, he didn't really do that in 2004, simply because he had not followed through on any of his promises. But if we think about this, in a lot of places, the primary language is not English in the home, it's Spanish. And first-generation Latino immigrants have trouble with English. You can get multilingual ballots. They're pretty standard in Arizona. However, a lot of the names don't really represent the Latino community. If you think about it here, down in Texas, of course, you've got Ted Cruz, who has Cuban ancestry. In Arizona, you've got Raul Grijalva, who is Mexican-American. But up here, who do Latinos have to vote for? How do you appeal to them, too? What promises could you possibly make? My candidate will consider your concerns, even though historically he probably hasn't. Okay. Minority populations. You can see that really minority populations are concentrated for the most part along the southern border or in Alaska. Of course, those areas of Alaska are not really considered habitable by the majority of white people. But yeah, if you look, you see high concentrations among the southern states, much higher concentration among the southern states than you do among most of the northern states. You see regions, in fact, one region right here is around Chicago. This is where New York City is here in this area. New Jersey, of course, here. But down in here, Southern California, Southern Texas, Florida, these are areas where you see 50% or more minority population. You look in here, it's much, much lower for the most part. Look at Maine itself, right? And surprisingly, like Vermont, as I said, but the funny thing about that is that Vermont is incredibly welcoming of minority populations. You can see here where Burlington is that it's actually gotten a little bit higher there. Asian American, this is just a breakdown of Asian Americans. You can find this in your book. Arab American. As I said, the majority of them tend to be Christian, not Muslim, Christian. Hispanic population, Puerto Rican, second largest group. It's overwhelmingly Mexican American, and a lot of that has to do with the acquisition of large tracts of what formerly used to be Mexico following the Mexican American War. Whoops, I accidentally hit my little wheel there. So other areas where they come from. Right now, in the United States of America, our population is only growing due to immigration. If we talk about fertility, which is the incidence of birth, and mortality, which is the incidence of death, they are roughly stable. We are really just replacing the number of people that die each year with the number of people born each year. The only way that our population is growing is because of immigration. Globally, immigration is at an all-time high. Mass migrations have occurred in a number of areas. Right now, there's a lot of Asians immigrating here. That's having an effect on our population. A lot of people coming up from Latin America as well. They are flowing into North America, Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. They're flowing out of rural areas and low-income nations. One of the things that's being created is the phenomenon of what are called transnationals. Now, these are people who develop ties in a country to which they immigrate, but also maintain ties in their country of origin. So they actually function as a link between two different societies and may create a bridge for more people to follow them as they, leading to a phenomenon called chain immigration. The second part here leads to a phenomenon called brain drain. The U.S. is more than happy to have immigrants that have profession skills come into this country. Also, following the 1965 Immigration Reform Act, which allowed families. So if you have a family member who's a U.S. citizen, it creates a pathway for you to immigrate to the U.S. And if you have technology, science, technology, engineering, and math skills, it's fairly easy to immigrate to the U.S. But, as I said, this creates brain drain in countries because if you're a doctor from India, where could your skills be put to greater use and do a greater amount of good? Here in the United States of America, where we already have a fairly high standard of living and lots of people practicing medicine, or in India, where there's still rampant starvation, rampant disease, population growth problems, all sorts of problems. So when we look at all of this here, immigrants tend to do well in U.S. society for the most part. They tend to adapt well into U.S. society. Immigration performs many valuable functions in U.S. society. From a functionalist perspective, there are jobs that immigrants hold, and I know this from having worked in the restaurant industry for 20 years. Do you hear the cry that immigrants are stealing jobs? Well, if it wasn't for immigrants, I could not have run some of the restaurants I managed because I did not have stacks of people who were born U.S. citizens lining up to work for me. A lot of the people, about half the staff or more in some restaurants, were immigrants. Of course, what this leads to is, from a conflict perspective, it leads to exploitation of minority groups. Right now, one of the big problems in the world is what's called servile marriage. It's considered one of the 4 forms of slavery, and it's essentially when a woman gets married to a man and then becomes the property of that man. breaking it down into its simplest terms. So when we see women wanting to immigrate to higher income nations, some of that is to escape servile marriage. The feminist perspective wants to look at this. Another thing that happens is women, as they immigrate, a lot of times it's because of human trafficking. Women are actively sought throughout the world to work in sex industries. So those are some of the things we have to consider. We've heard a lot of rhetoric about the border. What should we do with that? It's a long border that runs from Tijuana in Southern California all the way through Arizona, Mexico, New Mexico, and into Texas, where it terminates down around Brownsville. There's lots of opportunity for illegal immigration. It's become a cottage industry. There are what are called coyotes, who are people that lead immigrants across the border by way of long desert treks. 1986, it became illegal to hire illegal immigrants, illegal aliens. You have to make sure that your I-9 form, which is the INS Form 9, it's the form you have to fill out where you have to show a driver's license, social security card, birth certificate, something like that proves, or what's called an alien resident card, more commonly known as a green card, to show that you're here legally. This is the Arizona law I referred to earlier. In 2010, Arizona passed Arizona SB 1070, which essentially required police, if they were involved with somebody they suspected that had Hispanic origin, they were then required to make them establish citizenship. The intense debate we have over immigration reflects these essentially what we call a culture war going on. Some people see the value of allowing immigration to continue in the U.S. Some people think we need to seal our borders. There's an intense debate in immigration in other countries too. It's not just here in the U.S. society. Germany deals with immigration from Turkey. France deals with a large population from Northern Africa, Saharan Africa. England deals with a large immigrant population coming from the Caribbean islands and other regions. But there's intense debate over immigration. But when we think about it in terms of the U.S. here, who are the people that support allowing immigration and who are the people that oppose it? If we're going to get right down to it, you know, a lot of the people who oppose immigration here are children of immigrants themselves, because unless they're a member of a Native American tribe, we're all fairly recent immigrants to the U.S. society. I can trace my family back to 1639 in this country, but that's a drop in the bucket compared to going back 25,000 years and tracing your ancestry back to the Anasazi culture. So, just kind of looking here at the breakdown. Immigration to the U.S. was really restricted in the 19th century to Europe and Canada. It has become more open in the 20th century, and you can see following the 1960s that there was a large spike in population immigration from other countries, accompanying a decline in immigration from Europe and Canada. Okay. That concludes our lecture for today on Chapter 11, Race and Ethnicity. I hope you've enjoyed this.